Welcome to the very first Human Rights Culture Conversation, where we look at popular culture, film and television through a human rights lens. On today's show, the Oscar-winning film The Shape of Water, does it tell us anything new about Hollywood's treatment of disability? We'll also be looking at the extraordinary impact of the video made by Childish Gambino for his song This Is America, and we'll also bring a human rights perspective to the blockbuster movie Panther. Joining me today is my co-host Miro Griffiths MBE, a disability rights campaigner, a business consultant and a former advisor to the government of the United Kingdom. Dr Paul Darke, a UK-based film critic and rights activist, who's just stuck his thumb in the screen there, is with us too. A warm welcome to you both. Gentlemen, there was a time when films which focused mainly on black themes with majority black casts were destined for smaller cinematic releases. Such was the fear that they would bomb at the box office. Not anymore. Panther has grossed over $1.3 billion in worldwide box office receipts, thanks to equal helpings of positive word of mouth and political controversy. Depending on whom you talk to, Panther is either a glorious black power when we were kings fantasy, or a stirring endorsement of the ethno-centric state, held together by thrilling CGI special effects and an excellent cast mix of familiar faces and breakout talents. So, Miro, have you submitted to the brilliance of Panther yet?
I have seen it. I wouldn't necessarily think it was brilliant. I was intrigued when I went to see it because obviously there was this hype surrounding it. But actually, I came out and I thought it's 2018. It's quite interesting that this film comes out at the same time as social movements around the treatment of black people's communities, and also of having presidential figures across Europe and America as well, touting a line of very right-wing ultra-nationalism around protecting certain ethnic groups. And what we had was a film where it was about a black person fighting another black person, and the only redeeming person in the film was the noble lord at the end of it who killed the bad guy, who was actually talking about the idea of black people being suppressed and marginalized in America. So I came out feeling very underwhelmed after I saw it.
Dr Paul Darke, Miro is underwhelmed by Panther. What did you make of it?
Well, I think it's 2 hours of my life I'll never get back, which is absolute tragedy. I thought it was dreadful. I must be upfront and say I'm not a fan of the Marvel kind of dramas and all that kind of stuff, the kind of franchises. Some of them have been quite good. I've seen a couple. Guardians of the Galaxy I quite like. Deadpool I quite like. They've got a bit of wit and a bit of sophistication. I had a deep problem with Black Panther. I thought, and I'm deeply uncomfortable saying this, I thought it was incredibly racist, in the sense that I think it was made for a white audience and pandering to a kind of white audience sensibility of what blackness is. I also deeply had problems with the whole kind of narrative thrust. The fundamental saviour in it is the white guy. Wow, he's the one who drives the craft at the end and saves the guy, and you're thinking, no, please don't do this. And I was even more disturbed because I know Martin Freeman was asked what it's like to be the only white person on the set, and he said, it's how I imagine it is to be black, the only black person on the set. And you thought, no, you don't get any of this. You are utterly oblivious to what oppression and marginalisation is. I think it delivered a lot of kind of cliched notions of blackness for the white audience, from the kind of transferring the Amazonian woman to the African kind of village, etc. It kind of transposed the accepted conventions of capitalism onto a kind of a black state that legitimated a kind of white Western capitalism exploitation, and then the denouement of the kind of philanthropic charity towards the oppressed, unlike I'll buy one of their kind of old buildings and enable them to progress through my charity. And it was offensive fundamentally on kind of every level, and I think it's this whole notion, and I have a deal problem with it, and it's gotten across all groups, all communities, all societies, is that we need to work to kind of a progressive notion towards justice, and that is fundamentally bollocks, in the sense that you either have justice or you don't. There is justice or there isn't justice. This thing I will work to it kind of with through philanthropy is offensive. That's pandering to a kind of a capitalist, fundamentally white, but not exclusively, kind of agenda of maintaining the kind of hegemonic order of the status quo. It was atrocious on every level.
All right then. Nailing your colours firmly to the mast there, I think. This is the 18th film in the Marvel series, so you would have expected it to sort of run out of steam, but no. This film is the second highest grossing film of 2018, the third highest grossing film ever in the United States, the ninth highest grossing film of all time, and it's produced by, or it has a black director. You say it's racist, but some people would look at that information, that data, and say, this is the end of cinema's apartheid system as we know it. When I went to see this movie, there was, for a very rare moment, I saw many black faces in the cinema watching the film. It seems to have been enjoyed by a lot of people around the world. So what are they getting that you're not?
They're getting what a lot of disabled people get when they go and see a film about disability, and they recognise themselves in it because they are invisible. And just to see yourself once, you think, wow, that's me. The fact that it isn't, and the fact that it's dubious, is neither here nor there. And I think you've made a very clear distinction there between, you were going to say it's produced by a black person, when in fact it's just directed. It's produced by white people in the Marvel kind of franchise, fundamentally identifying a further market for exploitation. I don't mean exploitation in a negative way there. I mean in a kind of neutralised kind of like, there's a whole market there, and there's one there, we're doing this one, let's do that one. And again, I think a lot of people do like the Marvel kind of characters, and they do like that from all communities. And then to see yourself in that is quite exciting. You know, I quite like X-Men to start with. There's a guy in a wheelchair in it, you know, kind of futuristic wheelchair. But it says nothing about disability, just like Panther says nothing about being black. But you're just so pleased to see yourself there. And it's a very clever marketing ploy. And I don't mean that in a cynical way either, because I think it's good. And hopefully they'll have more characters. Interestingly, when they did the Asian one, they got a white woman to Asian up, so that they're not learning anything particularly. They're just spotting kind of commercial opportunities, which again I don't have a problem with. And actually, it will open the door for a lot of black directors and black narratives and black stories that will deliver on a lot more kind of culturally stimulating, inclusive and challenging material. But that wasn't Black Panther.
Miro, this film comes out after 8 years of the Obama presidency in the United States, which, whatever you say, has to have transformed the landscape. We could see on a daily basis a mixed-race president, his black wife and their children in the world's top political job, so to speak. So the point that a lot of people have made about this film, contrary to what Paul has said, was that there is a confidence about this movie. There is a confidence in the way in which it presents black people, the achievements of black people. Particularly as you compare to the kind of nihilistic images and narratives that came out of films made by black directors in the 1980s and 90s, particularly that genre of Boys in the Hood. I don't know if you've seen that. And also, of course, Do the Right Thing, classic one. So what do you make of the view that one of the strengths of this film is the ability to discuss race and place and belonging without the use of a racial loudhailer?
Well, I don't think it does that, because if you look at the story, what was quite interesting was when I left the auditorium in the theatre, I didn't even pick up on it first. It was my friend who picked up on it first, who said, "Isn't it interesting that in every Marvel film, or predominantly every Marvel film, the villain never usually dies at the end. There's always they return, they're reborn in a way to continue the narrative of the fight. But in this story, you have the the villain actually killed off. And what's he actually killed off for? He's actually killed off because his dream was to free black people through acquiring the wealth and resources of the monarchy. And actually that vision, that idea was what earned him his right to be killed off and no opportunity to return the story. So I think what you have here is, I get what you're saying, but I think the director and indeed the advisors and the producers who create this product, Black Panther, you have a very muddled narrative going on there, because you've got this. I felt like the director was making me choose during the film. Do I want to, or should I side with the noble prince who has this privilege and all this wealth and all these resources, or should I side with the revolutionary who is being suppressed by white supremacy in America and by gang violence and all the things that go along with that? But actually, in the portrayal of the revolutionary, who's Killmonger's character, you have somebody who actually portrays a thug, who's been involved in all this violence growing up, who is angry and is asking questions, but his portrayal is to say that he wants total domination and he wants to do it in a way that's going to cause as much misery and pain and violence to people, and you shouldn't accept that, and therefore he should be portrayed as the villain. So all this, from the director's position to the writers to the narrative, I just felt that it was so confusing in trying to determine what it was trying to articulate, that it left people just not necessarily asking questions. And the danger is, as Paul's alluded to, you have people holding it up as a beacon status when actually it doesn't do any of that. It does, and as Paul said, it paves the way for people to come beyond that and to actually try to hone the narrative and change the direction and ask the questions that could have been asked in this film, but didn't, because it relied too much on the Hollywood formula.
Let's sort of delve a little bit deeper into the politics around this film and the ability of this film to speak to two different audiences. The point that you make about how this film talks to a black audience, it does seem to push perhaps a conservative analysis of the black problem, in quote marks, if you allow me to say. But let's look at how some white commentators have used this film to endorse some of their political positions. So let me take you to the YouTuber. He counts himself as a philosopher. His name is Stefan Molyneux. I don't know if you've come across him, but he's extremely influential in the alt-right, as they call it. He got involved very heavily in the Trump campaign of 2015-2016, and he's done a lot of work around men's rights issues. Now, in his critique of the film, he starts with the proposition that Panther attempts to answer one of the key questions of our age: why is Africa poor and the West rich? Now, Molyneux claimed that Panther offers the politically correct view that Africa has been strip-mined of its resources by Europeans and left destitute. It then goes on to recommend a very politically incorrect solution. Isolationists must rule the mythical Wakanda, in-group preference must prevail, and the country must remain homogeneous. The magical vibranium on which the country's prosperity is built must be protected and preserved at all costs. Now, Paul, Stefan Molyneux uses that, as Miro hinted at the beginning of our conversation around this film, as an endorsement of this wall around America, fortress Europe policy. Did you see all of that in this movie, and what do you make of the way in which some right-wing commentators are using some of the themes of Panther to pursue their own political agenda?
I think the thing about movies, and almost all of them, is you can usually interpret them in whichever way you want. So I can see the elements that would bring that conclusion to that person seeing it that way from their own ideology. So, for example, there was a protectionism about, keeping the material hidden, and there was a thing about, that we shouldn't share it with other African nations. But I think that's fundamentally wrong, even of a reading of the film, as, I don't like it, that it was about unity, unifying. There is a kind of consensus amongst black people that as a community they need to support one another. They're not all separate, they're not all different, and that's the antithesis of kind of Trumpism and right-wing alt-right ideology, which is about creating division and isolation. And this film actually was a lot better than that. It was actually about community, sharing and supporting one another. And so even on a kind of simplistic level, he's wrong, you know. But actually there are elements that if you pick it out and ignore other bits, and that's what, in a way, the human condition is ignoring what challenges you and reconstructing it as something that reinforces your own ideologies. You can see that you can see his point of view. But I think even the film, as I saw it, as someone who didn't particularly like it, that is a misreading of it. And I think it was a lot more liberal, tolerant, leftist than that. I think I would say is it doesn't really deal with race because it's too trapped in a kind of narrative about Marvel and kind of superheroism. It deals with it, and that's where I think it falls down. So, for example, I think it was between the two main characters, i.e. the guy who was in Get Out and the King, not necessarily the kind of American that comes in, although he is a bit of it, is that kind of the battle between Malcolm X and the ideology of Martin Luther. And in the end, it comes fairly squarely down on the kind of Martin Luther one. And actually, I would say you probably need the Malcolm X one more than you need the Martin Luther one. And so, because of the kind of nature of oppression and its increasingness, and I think it was a very example that you said, for example, that you've had Barack Obama for 8 years. That's had a fundamental impact on America, and it did. And it led to Trump. And that's not an unrelated fact. And that shows you how a kind of moving towards a kind of liberal leftist consensus is not really going to work in a kind of capitalist philanthropic kind of mentality. And you need something that's going to be much more challenging than that. But I suppose the other thing I'd say about it is exactly what I say about disability movies. And most people think this is the most awful thing to say. And so I am allowed to say it, but I will. About disability, I say if normal people like it, there's something fundamentally wrong with it. And I would say, and if white people like it, in a black movie, there's probably something fundamentally wrong with it. And white people love Black Panther by and large. And that just makes me think, yeah, there's something fundamentally wrong with it.
All right, well, allow me to push back at that. As I say, there have been a ton of movies that have always talked about the black condition, the black mentality, what is wrong, racism, discrimination. And as I said in the question to Miro, it's always done with a loud hailer, the wagging finger, directing you in a didactic way to how you're supposed to see the black condition and what might be the solutions. I'm going to argue that 8 years of Obama have had an impact in the sense that you can now have that conversation, but it can be part of other conversations. It can be part of other themes in a film. And one of the glories I have to say about this film, I'm more towards your point. Well, I think all of us so far agree that this isn't a tremendous film, but one of the strengths of this film is that it's able to have a conversation about race in a way that is not the first thing that you noticed about the film. It is a story about characters, whether you think they're sympathetic or not, that's your point of view. But it is a film about characters, it's a film about how they react to situations. There is a story. Race is second or third or even fourth, perhaps, in the list of narratives. And I think that's got to be a good thing. However, Miro, it is a political film. What does it get right and what does it get wrong?
It gets a lot wrong. It gets more wrong than it gets right. I'll just say that. What is quite interesting, I think, the way to kind of emphasize this point is the ending of the film, as kind of Paul touched on. Whereas if you look at a lot of the social movements, predominantly in America, around Black Lives Matter and their reaction to white supremacy and the violence that is being created by people who are against black people's communities, what you've had is a response of trying to create international solidarity. You're trying to actually take things to a higher level. So, for example, we've seen where some of the early social movements were trying to take cases to the United Nations and try to highlight the incidents violence and deaths of black people. But from a political point of view, what the film does right at the end, as we kind of touched on, is that just rooting it in the neoliberal lens of, I'm going to save people because I've got all this wealth, and I'm going to buy all these buildings, and I'm going to help people through education. So almost reinforcing that kind of education as a commodity. You can buy it, you can create it, you can run it like a business in order to gain something from it, as opposed to understanding the significance of building solidarity and questioning why this kind of revolutionary figure who was angry from his upbringing and the way that black people are being treated in America came about and wanted to challenge that through his dialogue with T'Challa. So all the time you've got all these messages of, we could possibly go down this avenue of thought around race, or we could possibly go down this avenue of thought around the gentrification or black people's communities in America. But every time it possibly hinted that, it just goes back into its lazy narrative of capitalism is something that you shouldn't question. The neoliberal agenda around education, around people's individual responsibility should not be questioned. So at every step, the writers and the director have done nothing to challenge that. So when I come out of it, and again, I think Paul's point around how this fits into the Marvel universe is key, because the majority of people who are coming to watch this are just coming to see it because it's the next line of the film that they must watch, because it's a never-ending story of what's going to happen in the Marvel universe. You have to see this film to understand Marvel Infinity War, for example. Otherwise, you have no idea who this black person is when he's just come in to fight all these bad guys. So people are coming to it, and they're not necessarily using what I was going to talk about it when we talk about Childish Gambino, but it's that sociological imagination. It's how do you take the information, the narratives at the personal level, and contextualize them within the wider political and historical context that has created these key issues that we're trying to debate. But people don't do that, and people won't do that with this film. And the film doesn't actually try to prompt you to do that. It just wants to give you these 2 hours of, isn't this wonderful? Isn't this fantastic? Look at this marvelous story of the tremendous person rising up through power and wants to be the kind of Martin Luther King persona. So at the end of it, you're just left, as I said, at the beginning, which was quite politely, just underwhelmed, really. And nobody, again, if you're not in the circles of sociology, of political activism, and the people who do actually are key, the majority of people who will watch this won't get anything from it in terms of what we're talking about. They will just see it as another installment in that series of films that they must watch, that they must spend their £10 on to go and watch it in the cinema.
Finally, let's give Panther a rating out of 10, with 1 being terrible. We'll start with you, Miro. What do you make of Panther? What does it deserve as a rating?
I'd give it a 3.
Paul?
I'd give it a 5, partly because I'm sure if you know the narratives, it's good, but equally it is a stepping stone. It isn't what people want it to be, but actually it's good that it's been made, it's good that it's there, and actually it'll give the director, the actors and everything a greater profile to go on and do hopefully much more significant work.
Have you been convinced by our conversation? Because you began this discussion of Panther by saying it was a terrible film, and you're now giving it a 5.
It is a terrible film, but I put down some of that, or a significant as a film, that, like Miro said, to fully understand it, you had to have seen this one over here. I haven't seen that one over there, and so to some extent, it's not really for me. But I think, and I will bow to the wisdom of the box office, that the people who love the Marvel universe have all gone to see it, and actually the characters will continue, and so it's still the dreadful movie, I think it is. But actually, I think its significance will be much more on the careers of the individuals. And the director made Creed, and actually Creed, which is Rocky 17 or whatever, I don't know. It's actually quite a good little movie, and that's it. It's a little movie, even though it's Rocky. It's a very compact. It's about race. It's about masculinity, and so the director is a good director and he knows what he's doing. And actually, this will enable him to go on and make truly significant films. And again, the guy out of Get Out is in it, isn't he? He's one of the actors. And Get Out Get Out is a masterpiece. It is absolutely a masterpiece, and that about race cannot be bettered in the last 5 years, in my view. It's right up there with the Spike Lee early ones, like you mentioned. Absolute genius, and that's why I think this is a significant film for black film, and that's why I'd give it a 5.
Well, I was going to give it a 5. I don't know if I should increase my rating. I agree with everything that you've said, both you, Miro, and you, Paul. I think this is a film that is significant because it shows yet again that black directors can helm films that make a lot of money. I think that's important. I think the cast was excellent, and you mentioned the lead actor in Creed. He's also in my favourite TV show of all time, The Wire, which, anybody who has that in their back catalogue definitely is a talent worth taking note of. So I think it's going to be an important launching pad for several careers. And I think it's also interesting that you can have a conversation about race, which isn't the dominant narrative in the film, even though people will obviously say Panther is a film about the black conversation, this split between the sort of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King approach. So I'll give it a 6. I think I don't know if we'll be talking about it in 5 years, but I think certainly for the moment, as you say, Paul, we must bow to the wisdom of the box office. If you make 1.3 billion, you've got to have something going for you.